Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 14th session of the second season of Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, Asha, and Ganga Jamni online series. Before we start today's program, uh, let me first of all regret that due to certain personal issues, I could not be present for the last week's program. However, I would like to thank our last speaker, Professor Muhammad Sajjad, that he agreed to discuss some of the recent researches which have come out on Sir Syed and his contemporaries. It was, I am told, an excellent presentation. Uh, Unfortunately, I could hear only parts of that. Uh, uh, but the type of reports which have reached me, I'm really thankful to Sajjad Saab, who is my junior at Aligarh. I really thank him. Today we go back in time and take up an issue which is quite reflective of our popular culture as well as our traditions. I am referring to Lord Ram and the Ram tradition. It was during the 16th century that both Ram and Krishna traditions started developing at a popular level. In the Ayodhya and Banaras region, we had Tulsi, who wrote Ramcharitmanas and popularized the Ram legend. In the environs of Agra and Mathura, we had Surdas, who through his dohas popularized the Krishna cult. Both these Vaishnava traditions, whatever present day politicians would tell you, both these traditions started developing and growing from this period onwards, especially from the period which is known as the age of Akbar. Today, we have a scholar of art and culture who is going to present before us, in fact, introduce to us a work which highlights the impact of Ram cult on the cultural traditions of Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Dr. Parul Pandya Dhar has done much work on the art and culture of the subcontinent. She has also very recently, that is in 2021, edited a volume which is entitled The Multivalence of an Epic, retelling the Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia. And this book will form the focus of the talk today. But before that, let me introduce her to our young students. Professor Dhar teaches in the Department of History, University of Delhi. She is a historian of visual arts with several years of experience in the theory and practice of Indian performing arts. Her work engages with Indian art and architecture, art historiography, and connected histories of South and Southeast Asia. Having completed her undergraduate degree from Delhi University, she graduated in Bharatanatyam from Kalakshetra, Chennai. And then she did her graduate and doctoral studies from National Museum Institute, New Delhi, before she started a postdoctoral research. She got a fellowship for that at Freie Universität Berlin. I'm sorry if I am not able to take the name of this Berlin University correctly. Apart from the book, which we are going to, look into detail today, she has also authored a number of other important works. For example, the Torana in Indian and Southeast Asian architecture, which was written in 2010. Indian art history, changing perspectives, the very next year in 2011. She also has a number of co-edited works to her credit. Temple Architecture and Imagery of South and Southeast Asia was published in 2016. In 2014, 2 years before that, we have Asian Encounters, Exploring Connected Histories. And many years ago, in 2004, she edited a work, Cultural Interface of India with Asia. She has, as a scholar, also contributed a large number of research papers. She has been awarded the Alexander von Humboldt Postdoctoral Fellowship from Germany in 2007-8. The CAA Getty International Travel Award, US, in 2012 and 18, and the Nehru Trust UK Research Award in 2004. She has also served on the editorial committees of EFEO Paris and Visual Resources Journal, taken out by Taylors and Francis. She is currently writing on issues relating to art and mobility across the Indian Ocean, arts of early medieval Deccan, and is also collaborating on a book project on visuality and collective memory. Probably not many of us, especially the students, may have had the opportunity to read this work which we are reviewing today, The Multivalence of an Epic, retelling the Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia. It has a very steep cost. Welcome, Professor Dhar. We look forward that you may be introducing this work to us.
Thank you.
Before I
Thank
hand
you
over
very much.
space to her, thank you. But before I hand over the podium to her, let me also say that this book explores the journey and localization of the epic in its manifold expressions, from classical to folk, from temples and palaces to theaters and bylanes in cities and villages, and from ancient to modern times. Ramayanas from South and Southeast Asia are placed in deliberate juxtaposition to enable a historically informed discussion of their connected pasts across land and sea. The epic tradition is explored in this book beyond religious and socio cultural boundaries in a range of visual, literary, and performance expressions, which include sculpted, painted, inscribed, written, recited, and performed versions. The talk hopefully will engage with the inherent plurality, diversity, inclusiveness, and adaptability of this pan Asian epic tradition in changing socio political, religious, and cultural contexts, and with shifting norms, tastes, traditions, and ideologies. All things which, since a number of years, are being reduced to being aliens as far as we are concerned. We look forward to hear you, Professor Dhar, to tell us about this important work of yours. I welcome you once again, Professor Dhar. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Professor Razavi, for this generous introduction and also for a very erudite opening to the session of Multivalence of the Ramayana. I'd also like to thank Shagufta Siddhi and also, of course, again, Professor Razavi for inviting me today to share this work. The work actually began, the work towards this book, which came out in August last year, began in 2017 with an international conference that was held in Bangalore. And this conference was in honor of the late Professor D.S. Achyuta Rao, whose centenary celebrations were being organized by his son, Mr. D.A. Prasanna, in Bangalore, and Professor S. Setter, who by then was very busy and, as we now know, towards the last years of his life, had invited me to coordinate with him a conference, the starting point of which was something that is pluralistic, something that is inclusive, and something that has a diversity of tradition. And I suggested to him this topic of the Ramayana that goes across the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia. He was very welcoming of the suggestion and promptly asked me to go ahead and do the needful. Well, we managed to keep our primary goals in mind and invited. We were very successful in inviting a very good, very knowledgeable group of scholars. We were very particular that Southeast Asians should be represented by local Southeast Asians living in Southeast Asia, South India, similarly, and of course, scholarship of very high caliber that resides in Europe and the US, but has been devoted to South Indian and Southeast Asian studies. So, with these in mind, we began in 2017, and the book has been brought out in 2021, published by Manipal Universal Press. So without much ado, I should begin. We've heard the name of the book now a couple of times, The Multivalence of an Epic, Retelling the Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia, explores the journey of the Ramayana on either side of the Eastern Indian Ocean at multiple levels. It does not, let me begin with what it does not do. It does not dwell upon issues of origins and antiquity, and it does not pretend to offer a comprehensive account of all the Ramayanas ever told in these two broader regions. Instead, it offers focused readings of chosen moments in the development of the epic and seeks to understand the many values and meanings that the epic has assumed. It also then looks at the processes that have shaped the transformations of the epic tradition. The book engages with the inherent plurality, diversity, and adaptability of the epic in changing spatial and temporal contexts, in different genres and mediums, from classical to folk, from temples and palaces to theatres and bylanes, and from ancient to contemporary times in South India and Southeast Asia. Why South India? It could as well have been East India, it could have been North India. The reason is that we wanted to actually take up two regions and look at them in terms of analogous processes, historical processes, what historians of the Indian Ocean have termed as cultural convergence. And so I will just come to that in a while. Now, the three sections, visual, literary, and performance cultures, expectedly intersect and illuminate each other, and yet these are distinct forms of expression with their characteristic techniques, narrative structures, and operative principles that inform their formal, stylistic, compositional, and emotive qualities. This is as the art is practiced. But in scholarship too, visual, literary, and performance cultures require specialized understandings and interpretive methods. This rationale determined my configuration of the three interrelated parts as the editor of the book, which are then brought together to enable an understanding of their intertwined histories. It is ultimately the collective expertise of the contributors to this volume that has facilitated such an approach. For nobody is a king of all or a queen of all. The term retelling as a special communicative quality of the epic has not been limited here to verbal, prose, and poetic renditions only, not to the spoken and the written only, but also used across other artistic expressions. A painter, for example, pictures a story as received, recollected, and reworked in the mind's eye, and tells it in the language and narrative structures specific to the art of painting. Its translation then from, let's say, the oral to the painted medium is also a retelling. South Indian and Southeast Asian Ramayana traditions are placed in deliberate juxtaposition, as Professor Rezavi just mentioned, to enable a more, what should I say, comparative kind of an investigation. Historians investigating the cultural, political, and socio-economic processes that have linked pre-modern India and Southeast Asia have for several decades now proposed the theory of cultural convergence. And I think this audience would be very familiar with Harman Kulke. He is one of the very well-known proponents of the theory of cultural convergence in the study of Southeast Asia, East India, and South India. Now, developments in regional political formations and cultural expressions in early medieval South India and in Eastern India are in many ways comparable to those observed in different parts of Southeast Asia, separately, not as a monolithic, so not Southeast Asia as a monolithic whole, but in different regional, regions and sub-regions of Southeast Asia. Readers will find in the organization of this book a potential resource to explore epic encounters across the Indian Ocean through the prism of cultural convergence. This is something that has been in my mind in the way that the chapters have been organized, for example. So I have not separated out the Indian context from the Southeast Asian context. Now, the Valmiki Ramayana, as we all know, is accepted as the earliest complete Ramayana. But it draws from earlier oral and dispersed traditions with a core that antedates later accretions to it. The larger consensus for the date of Valmiki Ramayana ranges from 7th century BC, Robert Goldman, for its earliest parts, to 3rd century CE for later accretions. And this includes all the 7 kandas, with the Balakanda and the Uttarakanda being the latest editions. The Buddhist Dashrath Jataka also reveals a shared core of characters, elements, and motifs. The many classical and vernacular Ramayanas across South and Southeast Asia include not only Hindu Ramayana traditions, but also the Jain Ramayanas, beginning with the Paumacharyu of Vimalasuri, dated to the 3rd, 4th century, and then those of Islamic affiliation, such as the Malay Hikayat Seri Rama, and also Hikayat Maharajavana or Hikayat Maharavana, the story of Ravana, among others, in addition to other genres like Natakas and Kavyas. Only a cross section, and that's why many times I say the book is a beginning, let's have more books. Only a cross section of this staggering variety finds representation in this volume, but what does present itself is sufficient to meaningfully take forward, conceptually and empirically, the influential and enriching scholarship on the many Ramayanas. And how can we forget A.K. Ramanujan and his 300 Ramayanas? And then Paula Richman. Both of them have worked on the many Ramayanas. And then, so that's one aspect. And then the varied Asian Ramayanas. So the names that come to my mind from the early Sahitya Academy conferences, V.R. Raghavan, Srinivas Iyengar, K. Krishnamurti, and Kapila Vatsyayan. So before I go further, I would also like you to see some parts, some of the more visually promising parts of the book through a PowerPoint presentation. And I'll just share the screen. Have I shared it? Is the screen shared? Okay, I'll assume that the screen is shared. So the first part focuses on visual cultures. The first part of this book focuses on visual cultures. And before I go to visual cultures, these are the perspectives that I was listing out. The approach in the book focuses on the Ramayanas beyond socio-religious borders, especially in the context of Indian Ocean crossings across South India and Southeast Asia, looking at issues of the intermediality and the intertextuality of the epic, as in different genres of visual, literary, and performance cultures, and of course, through the prism of cultural convergence. So, coming to now to the first part of the book, which focuses on visual cultures, including sculptures, paintings, and I have put inscriptions together with that, primarily because the material context of these inscriptions, as you see in this wonderful painting from a site called, from a place called Malirunchole, in one of the chapters of the book by R.K.K. Rajarajan, you can see that they run together very often. And so the first section, these are also the earliest evidences of the Ramayana, both in different parts of South India and in different parts of Southeast Asia. So this is what we begin with. The presence of mythological epic characters and themes for political posturing are also in evidence from an early period in the inscriptions. Now, the authors to this section, and I will name them one by one, the authors unfold a rich tapestry of sculptures, paintings, and inscriptions, where the earliest carved narratives from the Deccan and the Deep South, discussed on the one hand by me and next by Valerie Gillette, in two separate essays, share space with images such as a 7th century Rama sculpture from Phnom Penh in faraway Cambodia. So, what you see to the right is actually a sculpture of Rama from a site in southern Cambodia. In a Phnom is a mountain. Phnom Penh is a place in southern part of Cambodia, where the earlier remains of a Hindu Buddhist world have unfolded. And you have this as a group of other, which was found along with a group of other sculptures of deities. This belongs to the region of Phnom Penh, and I'll come back to it. Now, these kind of images in the 7th and 8th century enter into a dialogue with each other straight away. The Cambodian image in the book has been discussed by Sirang Leng and John Brockington. Now, such deliberate juxtapositions throw open a range of observations and questions, of which some, though not all, find their answers within the pages of this book. Inscriptions about Ram and Ravan reveal the importance of the epic in the political imagination on both sides of the Bay of Bengal. My essay looks at that's the opening essay. It looks at Ramayana sculptures from early Western Chalukya and Hoysala periods in Karnataka to interpret shifts in the epic's thematic emphasis and narrative strategies. Beginning with the 5th century and gradually increasing in number and variety, dynastic eulogies compare kings to Ram. His status as an avatar or deity is nascent in a few inscriptions. His iconography, however, remains that of an epic hero, except for a rare, almost iconic but not yet cultic portrayal at Pattadakkal. And I would like you to look at your far left here, an image on one of the on the southern wall of the Virupaksha at Pattadakkal has Rama with the bow, what becomes Kodanda Rama later. And, iconographically, he has Sita on one side and Lakshman on the other. But it is not a cultic image. One, it is on the outer wall of the temple, and it is actually an abbreviated narrative where Sita longingly, which what is reflected by her, the way she lifts up her neck, looking yearningly at Maricha as the golden deer. And it's the turning point where all the trouble actually begins. This one, the one in the center, is from the Durga temple at Aihole on the Adhisthana or the basement. On the northern side, you have the Ayodhya Kanda and the Aranya Kanda, and on the southern side, you have the Sundara Kanda. And here you see Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana leaving Ayodhya and moving ahead. So to come back, now this is Ram. Ravana appears as a formidable adversary and gains in positive estimation in epigraphs from the early decades of the second millennium, so 1000 onwards. But in sculpture, this is why a corroboration has really helped. Sculpture is actually speaking 3 centuries before and giving a positive estimation of Ravana in the sculptures of the period, something I have tackled in other papers and which I will not get into at present. Now, From this period, 7th, 8th century, the Valmiki Ramayana grows gradually distant, and its core, if you see, from the 5th century, you have Kadamba inscriptions and Western Ganga inscriptions and others in the region of Karnataka. So there's this, the epic is well known. You have inscriptions mentioning the Valmiki Ramayana in Karnataka and in other parts of the south, but the Valmiki Ramayana is known, but processes of localization, change, adaptation, oral traditions is already has already begun in the 4th, 5th centuries. Um, so the distance from the Valmiki Ramayana grows, and localizing tendencies that are nascent in the 7th century become assertive by the turn of the millennium, 4 centuries later. Influenced by Vaishnava and Veerashaiva movements, the Jain Ramayans and popular beliefs then also come into play. At certain moments, as in 8th century Pattadakal, the epic becomes more urgently central to political imagination. Helen Wexler has worked on it, so have I, and so have some others. Coming then to Ramayana imagery, which appears on temples of varied sectarian affiliations, uh, which reflects its assimilation in the larger socio-cultural and moral universe. So there is no stopping the Ramayana narratives from a Shaiva temple. They are in fact very often on Shaiva temples. Ramayana is discussed in Jain contexts. I just mentioned the Buddhist Jataka, and we will come to Islamic Ramayanas in a little while. Ramayana sculptures, particularly of themes drawn from its later parts. Later parts, I mean the later kandas. So the Sundara Kanda, the Yuddha Kanda, are usually located on the southern surfaces of temples, suggesting a kind of a relative directional understanding of the epic's mythical geography. Visual imagery such as this, you have a beautiful scene of the Setu Bandhana. These are Hanuman's followers, and they're carrying stones to build the Setu. So visual imagery such as this, frozen in stone, actually holds clues to lost texts of the period, and also to performance practices. For anyone into performance studies, the influence of performance practices on this central panel showing the Setu Bandhana is very difficult to miss. Gaps in sources of one type are filled in by traces from other sources of past centuries. Valerie Gillett from EFEO Paris questions the dearth of, compared to the Chalukya land, there is a dearth of Ramayana imagery in Pallav period temples, and this is what she questions. Other than, you have to leave aside depictions of Ravana in a Shaiva context. Now, this situation contrasts with the epic's considerable presence in what just went by, the Western Deccan, what I just discussed. The period of Chola rule after the Pallavas also accords significant space to the Ramayana in the visual repertoire. A detailed iconographic identification and analysis leads Gillett to propose that Rama is actually portrayed sometimes in panels. This image from the Vaikuntha Perumal temple that you see on the screen is actually much ignored. It shows Rama and Lakshmana, and usually the Ramayana scenes are lacking. She's gone ahead and identified some very important depictions which have so far been ignored. And she concludes that Rama is portrayed in panels representing Vishnu in battle. So as an avatara, as an incarnation, on the Kailashanath and the Vaikuntha Perumal temple in Kanchipuram. And this kind of a depiction actually fits well with the Pallava dynasty's royal discourse. Sculptures from the Hoysala period in Karnataka, which I just showed you the Setu Bandhana, which was discussed in my essay, then meets paintings, Nayaka period paintings from the Marli Runchole in Tamil Nadu, which bear inspiration from the Alvar hymns and Kamban's Iramavataram, brought into discussion by Keshava Rajarajan. Chola and Vijayanagara metal icons of Ramayana characters is the subject of Sharada Srinivasan's essay, and it reveals the value of those bronze icons as processional icons of great aesthetic value in temple rituals. Rachel Loizu and John Brockington discuss second millennium Angkorian Ramayana relief sculptures from Cambodia, which reveal a preference for battle scenes, such as this one showing Vali and Sugriv in combat. And just see here the two brothers in their ascetic. They've left Ayodhya. They are living in Vanvas. Here is Rama actually deceitfully killing Vali. Lakshmana is by his side, pointing to Vali. And here is a distraught Tara, who is then holding Vali as he meets his death. So images of this kind reveal preference. In fact, in Cambodia, you will see that the Yuddha Kanda is very popular. Not to say that the other Kandas are absent, they are there. But there is a distinct preference for the more martial, the more combative episodes of the epic in this region. This is part of Rachel Loizu's paper and also John Brockington's paper in the volume. Let me also take another one. New subjects are explored which are not represented in India. Vali Sugriv is, of course, very well represented in India. But here you have the Nagapasha episode, which becomes a particular favorite in Southeast Asia. And you see Rama and Lakshmana are tied in the Nagapasha. And it's on the lintel of a temple in Phimai in Cambodia. Mary Brockington and Gauri Parimu Krishnan elaborate on the colorful character transformations of Hanuman in Southeast Asia, which both in their visual and literary transformations. So the character of Hanuman actually undergoes major transformations in Southeast Asia and offers a counterpoint to presumed monolithic concepts of Hanuman in popular Indic imagination. And of late, we have an angry Hanuman, but the less said about him, the better. Cheryl Tiruchelvam introduces contemporary negotiations. This is the last essay in the visual section, which has eight contributions by some of our very good scholars, Ramayana scholars. And Cheryl Tiruchelvam of Malaysia, she introduces contemporary negotiations of the epic in the visual arts of Malaysia, linking them to the shadow puppet, Wayang Kulit tradition, and the hikayats of Islamic affiliation. Wayang Kulit, and that's why you see, the character of Hanuman or any of these. There is a lot of, Ramayana has entered the contemporary arts of Malaysia in very interesting ways. Ghulam Sarwar Yusuf explores that later, and so I will be coming back to what happens to the epic there. It has now, this Wayang Kulit in Malaysia, contemporary visual arts of Malaysia, has evolved from its traditional leather puppet forms to the canvas and has also become digitized, even combined with modern stories and characters into what is today called fusion Wayang Kulit. Coming to literary cultures, which is the second section, This section engages with texts, their content, narrative accent, recitation, and associated imagery. It opens with a discussion on governance and ethics in 9th century old Javanese Ramayana. 9th century is really early for a text in Southeast Asia, and it is expectedly from Java that you have the Ramayana Kakavin. This Ramayana Kakavin is known to have taken in large measure from a 7th century Indian text, the Ravana Vadha or the Bhatti Kavya, written by poet Bhatti. But the Ramayana Kakavin didn't draw just from the Bhatti Kavya, nor did it just only draw from Indian texts, but apart from the Bhatti Kavya, it also took on its inspiration from other Indian texts. This is a fantastic paper by Malini Saran that forms the first paper in the section on literary cultures. For example, there was a unique ideal of governance that is created in Rama's articulation of the Ashtabrata to Vibhishana. And these Ashtabrata includes actually the Ashtadikpalas, Dikpala imagery. What a king should be like, what are the ideal characteristics that the king needs to govern, and the Dikpalas are used for comparison in that. Now, this then transforms into a Javanese text on kingship in the 14th century and has had a great impact on ideas of ethics and governance in Islamic courts in Java. A close reading of this Javanese text suggests that it was written for recitation and for the art of Vayankulit, which I just referred, that is shadow puppetry, thus then fusing the boundaries between the textual and the performative traditions. Now, unlike the 9th century text in Java, that is the Ramayana Kakavin, coming to Thailand, no Ramayana text from a period earlier than the 18th century has survived in Thailand. And this is on account of the destruction of Ayutthaya by the Burmese army in 1767 AD. This is brought up in Chirapat Prapanda Vidya's essay on the Thai Ramayana tradition. Now, the Thai Ramayana is actually first suggested from what remains to us, is first suggested in an inscription of 1292 AD through the mention of a Rama cave and the name of Rama Khamheng, the third king of Sukhodaya. The second Thai king was Ayutthaya, or the second Thai king ruled from Ayutthaya or Ayutthaya in that is the period of the second Thai kingdom is 1350 to 1767 AD, which connected Rama's story by the name itself, Ayutthaya, and also by the coronation name of the king. The coronation name of the king was Rama. Rama Tibodhi, actually Rama Tibodhi in Thai is Ramadhipati in Sanskrit, and this is a name that is adopted by several later kings. The recomposed Thai Ramakiyan in Ramakiyan is Ramakirti, the song in praise of Rama, is attributed to the first king of the Chakri dynasty. So now we are talking of the recomposed 18th century Ramakiyan. And the king's name itself is very interesting. The king is called King Phra Buddha Yodfa Chulalok, or King Rama I. So he draws from both the Buddhist and the Rama tradition. Buddha and Rama come together in his name, and he ruled from 1782 to 1809 during the Bangkok period in Thailand. So while the Thai Ramakiyan is likely to have been composed in Prapandavidya's analysis from a Ramayana story retold by a narrator from South India. And in this, we had a wonderful dialogue between Keshava Rajarajan and Chirapat Prapandavidya during the conference. Uh, but there are carvings of Khmer temples in northwest Cambodia, very close to the Thai border, and where you have the Valmiki Ramayana shown. So this is from Bante Chamar, where you have the scene of the two Krauncha birds, which out of which one is shot by the hunter and the other one grieves. That is the opening of the Valmiki Ramayana. You have Brahma in the center. The one without the head seems to be Valmiki, and the one at the rear end is Bharadwaja. So both the Valmiki Ramayana and the southern versions of the Ramayana, perhaps including the Kamba Ramayana, Iramavataram, and many other oral traditions, many performative traditions which are not available to us from this time period, existed side by side. If I may also mention a 7th century inscription here, which is not part of this paper, but I would like to bring in my own work. 7th century in Mizon area, you have in Chakyu, you have an inscription of the charm king Prakashadharman Vikrantavarman, where temple to Valmiki is mentioned. But there is a lot of correlation between southern versions, eastern versions of the Ramayana, which have already undergone changes. So the connections between these various parts of India and various parts of Southeast Asia were not linear, were not of a particular moment only, but they kept transpiring through circuitous routes. Coming to Mary Brockington's paper. Now, Mary Brockington introduces the enigmatic female Benyakai or Benjakai, a Rakshasi. In some tellings, Benjakai makes a vain attempt to counterfeit a dead Sita to deceive Rama. But in the Thai narrative that Mary Brockington talks about, Benjakai lives on in a romantic liaison with Hanuman. So this is a painting, a fresco at Wat Pho, and you see the Khmer script there. And here you have Benyakai, who is, after that motif of counterfeiting, is then, being taken across the sea by Hanuman. And it is during this process that the romantic liaison between Hanuman and Benyakai happens. She has tried to trace, Mary Brockington has tried to trace the origins of this motif. And, she sort of enters in her search in a complex web of sharing and innovation of narrative elements and motifs among intra-Southeast Asian, so Thai, Javanese, and Malay, so on, and then between India and Southeast Asia. It's not, you can't just look at the Valmiki Ramayana or just the Bhatti Kavya or just Iramavataram to arrive at this. So this is a very interesting and important point raised in her essay. Coming to the Ramayanas of Kerala, A.J. Thomas discusses Ezhuthachan's Adhyatma Ramayanam Kilipattu, a Malayalam bhakti text. Kilipattu is a narratological technique in which narration takes place in a parrot's voice, and that's why Kilipattu. The historical context of the composition is the rising power of the Zamarin of Calicut in the 13th and 14th centuries that caused centuries of entrenched social exclusion and injustice, with the common folk having no access to the scriptures of the Sanskrit language. Irithachan led a revolutionary devotional movement by rendering the scriptures in Malayalam. Though the composition of Adhyatma Ramayanam Kilipattu, in which Rama features as a supreme deity, through this, Edithachan sparked the latent sentiment of bhakti or inclusive personal devotion and led this bhakti tradition to its pinnacle. So the story of social exclusion and what Edithachan does is explored by A.J. Thomas. Translation itself is an act of retelling, and this is the essence of Sudha Gopalakrishnan's contribution to the volume, where she recreates Kumaran Ashan. Kumaran Ashan's time is 1873 to 1924. His Malayalam poetic text, Chinta Vishtayaya Sita, she translates this very sensitively in English. Now, the poem unfolds at a significant juncture in Sita's life. I have deliberately juxtaposed in today's talk this very contemplative Sita from Rachel's paper. It is a sculpture from Bafuon, 11th century, in the Angkor region of Cambodia. Hanuman has brought the identification or mark of Rama to her. She looks completely contemplative and lost. But this Sita is a Sita, the Sita of Sudha Gopalakrishnan's paper, Chinta Vishtayaya Sita, Kumaranasan's text, is a Sita who has been through it all, who has been abandoned and who is in Valmiki, in the ashrama of Valmiki. The poem unfolds when both her sons, Lava and Kusha, and Valmiki, who have been her solace in exile, are with Rama in Ayodhya. In the meditative serenity of the twilight hour, she meets herself in the solitude of Valmiki's ashrama. This Sita is a detached Sita. This is a modern reinvention by Kumaranasan, candidly honest and filled with grace and dignity, allowing her unfettered mind to explore and embrace truths about herself and truths about Ram. As the author informs, that is, as Sudhaji informs, for this retelling, Kumaran Ashan had met with severe criticism. Moving from translation now to recitation as an act of retelling, Thomas Hunter brings to the book his own decades of research on the Mabasan Ramayana recitation in Bali in Indonesia. Text, recitation, translation, and performance are at work together here in an inextricable combination. So Hunter locates the Balinese Mabasan sessions, such as the one that you see on the screen, as being part of a larger engagement with the Indian commentarial tradition, Vyakhya. It is not just the Ramayana recitation, but the whole idea of a line being said, recited, and then the whole Vyakhya tradition, which is also in the translation techniques developed by religious and literary experts of first millennium Java. The final section is on performance cultures. In her essay, Paula Richman places the epic antagonist Ravan center stage by drawing attention to two modern theatrical performances, Ravan Odbhavam, or The Origins of Ravana, performed in Kathakali and composed in an 18th century mix of Sanskrit and Malayalam, and Ilankeshwaran, or The King of Lanka, again Ravana, which is a mid-20th century Tamil mythological drama. Ravana's portrayal in these are different from his earlier representations, in which the image that you see on screen essentially is a representative image. Ravana's portrayal in these two are very different from his other portrayals, where Ravana is usually seen relative to Rama as the antagonist, as the anti hero, evaluated and measured in terms of Rama, or even in the more devotional Ramayanas like the Adhyatma Ramayana of this, or the Adbhut Ramayana, where Ravana knows his destiny, and then that takes on a very devotional flavor. But that again is also in terms of Rama. But here, Paula Richmond talks about how Ravana is placed center stage and seen for himself. She demonstrates how uh, a familiar epic narrative changes its tenor when viewed from the perspective of the antagonist. And in times of social and political anxieties, the rule of Ravan appears to have then offered alternative possibilities. Ravana Rajya. Far away in Malay, in the Malay Peninsula, the Vayang Kulit Kelantan that I spoke about in terms of the shadow puppets is also based on a local oral version known as Hikayat Maharajavana or Hikayat Maharavana. That is the story of Ravana. We are now in Malaysia. Thus, Ravanayana and not Ramayana. This comes forth in Ghulam Sarwar Yusuf's essay, where episodes and characters from the Ramayana are reworked and transformed in local theatre. The near total elimination of Hindu gods in the Malaysian shadow play and echoes of popular Islam in Malay version of the epic are seen. For example, the very interesting encounter between Adam, who is sent by Allah, and Ravana, who, on account of his misconduct, falls from heaven to Lanka. And then there is this very interesting interaction between Ravana and Adam. And Ravana is given 3/4 of Lanka, and 1/4 is kept by Adam. Krishnamurti Hanuru discusses folk versions of the epic as rendered in the Kannada vernacular and interprets how, now I'm coming to the by-lanes in the vernacular traditions, interprets how characters of the epic were transformed to suit the ideals of the folk world. Different folk performatives popularized this epic through performances. While Sita is usually idealized for her chastity and Rama for his moral rectitude, several folk performances also tend to contradict these widely held cliches or views. As in many parts of Karnataka, it is Hanuman's character that is idealized. And there's a lot of, in the performances, there's a lot of comedy that is introduced. There is a lot of spontaneity that is introduced into these folk musical performatives or theater performatives. Prompt improvisations by composers, musicians, and actors, and also don't leave out the audience, the spectators, who are integral to the staging of a Yakshagana epic performance, is discussed by Purushottama Bilimale. He elaborates upon the processes whereby a Yakshagana Ramayana is continuously recreated on the spot, redefined, recoded, communicated, and appropriated. Similarly, Sirang Leng, and so I juxtaposed a Khmer performative here. Sirang Leng's essay on the performance of the Khmer Riamker bears a deep imprint on present-day society in far-off Cambodia. The Cambodians have adapted the 16th, 17th century Riamker story, that is Ramayana story. Again, Ramakirti. Remkar is Ramakirti. Ramakian is also Ramakirti, that is in Thailand. Remkar is in Cambodia, to meet their modern day concerns. Of special interest is the innovative episodic treatment that I was just talking about by the local village community. So Reemkar takes place in the context of a palace, as you see in the bottom right with the Golden Deer episode. And it also takes place, these are both more formal urban presentations of the Reemkar. You have Ravana and Rama mask dance. This is, but you also have Reemkar in villages, and the episode that I'm quoting now is from a village. So the episode of Kumbhakarna blocking the waters, for example, all these are additions. So he blocks the waters, and Rama tricks him to release the water. The villagers believe that such an enactment bestows the desired rainfall to them. And there are many other anecdotes of this kind. Interestingly, the most respected and popular characters in contemporary Reemkar performances in Cambodia, also in Vietnam for that matter, are Ravana and Hanuman. Hanuman is larger than life, as is Ravan, and they are the ones that who are looked up to. And the villagers address them as Lokta Tosakmuk. Tosakmuk is Dashamukha, and Lokta Kamheng, that is Hanuman. So this is what the book is about, but what did it do to me in the 4 years is what I would like to briefly sum up in the last section on interpretive frames that I took up as part of my introduction to the volume. All of this that I talk about is part of my introduction to the volume, but this is the sar, the nichod, the essence of what happens. And I found myself thinking through this material, connecting the dots, and trying to understand essentially what is it that we come to know through such richness of material. And if you allow me a couple of minutes more, I would like to sum it up quickly for everyone. So, how does one view all of this? How does one come to some kind of an understanding about what has determined the epic's multivalence? Let me begin by saying that the characteristic interplay of continuity and change in the development of the Ramayana epic is essentially rooted in elements that are what one may conceptually call intrinsic to its narrative structure as a Mahakavya or a great poem, and then in its consequent ability to extrinsic socio-political, cultural, religious contexts that have shaped its reception, translation, and transcreation over time. Now, obviously, the extrinsic affects the way the intrinsic develops later, and the intrinsic also is an agency in the extrinsic. So I'm not suggesting that these two are unrelated, but they are certainly possible to view as conceptual categories that influence each other. Now, in operation, the intrinsic and extrinsic, or the inner and outer worlds of the poem, interrelate and overlap in complex ways. It is in the structure of the Mahakavya itself, in its early development from a core plot or theme, which likely had its origins in oral traditions, and in its accretions over time, that its subplots and sub-themes lend themselves to independent expression, even when they cohere as meaningful parts of the whole. This internal structure of the epic. So the Mahakavya lends itself to episodic treatment. Any one episode can be complete in itself, and often it is just an episode that moves ahead. Sometimes the entire Ramayana, like Ravana Vadha, went in its entirety to Java. and more complex, more complete, more episodic retellings then emerge. At times, the epic is translated in its entirety, at other times, only in parts. Categories of intrinsic and extrinsic, change and continuity, and parts and whole then offer useful perspectives to unravel the epic's multivalence. As it flows and adapts, its unique identity as the Ramayana sustains, even as it merges in a stream of continuous change. This assimilative power, its pluralism, is also its soul and strength. So, if we create a monolithic mega Ramayana, which is the only Ramayana, then it dies. The reason it's living is because it is assimilating, because it is pluralistic, because it is diverse. The concepts of cultural convergence and localization, well known in the historiography of pre modern connections between India and Southeast Asia, offer another useful analytical framework. I have discussed it earlier, so I will not go into its details here. This argument can also be used as a historical rationale for analogous developments of the Ramayana tradition across the two broad cultural zones on either side of the eastern Indian Ocean. Visual evidence of the Ramayana and its characters begins to appear from about the 6th, 7th century in parts of southern India. Valmiki and his epic composition are known in the region's epigraphic records from about the same time. From Southeast Asia, you have the 7th century sculpture in the round of Rama with his bow as an avatara of Vishnu from Funumda. But the epic narratives begin much later, whereas epic narratives begin earlier in southern India. The late 6th, 7th century time frame in Southeast Asia has also yielded inscriptions such as the Filkantal inscription or the Veelkantal inscription, which alludes to Ramayana, and the Valmiki inscription, which I mentioned from Champa in Vietnam. Southern India reveals an earlier corpus of inscriptions compared to Southeast Asia from at least the 5th century. I mentioned the Kadambas, the Western Gangas, and so on. Fragmentary references to Rama's story appear in later Shangam literature, while Ramayana gains greater presence in the Alvar hymns of Vaishnava saint poets, notably Kulashekara Alvar's Perumal Tirumoli. Sukanya Anandi Krishnan has worked on this, which includes an abridged retelling of Rama's story, and it is also known as Kulashekara Ramayana or the Mini Ramayana. This is followed by Ramayana references in regional texts such as the Kaviraja Marga, the rational transformations of the Jain Ramayanas, particularly Karnataka is very rich in it, Kamban's masterpiece in Tamil, Iramavataram, and a host of other South Indian epic traditions. Ramayana texts from Southeast Asia, except for the Javanese Ramayanas, the Kakavin Ramayana that we discussed in Malini's paper, are mostly after the 16th century, including the Reamker of Cambodia and the Thai Ramakian. They are all post 16th century. And therefore, the visual and the inscriptional evidence becomes of great importance. While the Valmiki Ramayana is known in parts of South India and Southeast Asia, localization begins already by the 7th century very clearly. It is in the 7th century in both sides of the Indian Ocean that you have localization processes. And already Ravanavadha or Bhatti Kavya, composed by Bhatti in the region of Vallabhi in Western India, becomes a direct inspiration for the 9th century Ramayana Kakavin. But despite such clear congruences, the Javanese Ramayana Kakavin also alters and interpolates in big ways. This is something we already discussed, how it becomes an ideal text for ethics and governance, and how it is carried forward in Java. In the Tamil region, Kamban's Iramavataram draws from the Valmiki Ramayana, but its motives, characters, and related internal structure are configured towards making it a greater devotional poem in a distinctly Tamil milieu. And everyone, please read David Schulman for this. With time, processes of assimilation across the many sub-regions of South India and Southeast Asia reveal diverse priorities, motivations, proclivities, and selective adaptations. The characterization of Rama shifts from that of a divine hero and avatara to a cult deity in some contexts, while in other situations his role becomes completely attenuated. And the perspective of a subplot may actually shift to Ravana or to Sita or to Hanuman. Ram exits or becomes very irrelevant. The epic moves across the spectrum, variously addressing concerns that belong to the realm of the mytho-religious in varied contexts: Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, Islamic, and they take on sometimes aesthetic, at other times political, at other times social premises. Uh, it has been received, selectively assimilated to address different communities of beliefs and ideologies. Even within Hinduism, varied mainstream and reformatory bhakti epic traditions have emerged and prospered. The localizations of the parts and whole of the epic in response to varied extrinsic contexts are deeply complex, and one may only begin to categorize these contexts and processes. Should we call it selective assimilation, interpolation, inversion, eclecticism, or any other modes of adaptation? The journeys are nonlinear and circuitous, with intra and inter-regional connections within and across South India and Southeast Asia. Categories of Margi Desi, Shastriya Laukik, and Natya Dharmi Lokadharmi, that is classical, folk, or stylized or commonplace, which belong to performance practice and theory, offer useful perspectives for interpreting the many values attached to the epic. The selective transference and creative translation of narrative motifs and elements, the change in character portrayals, the omissions, additions, and elaborations in the spread of the epic transpire not only across regions or over time, but also vertically. They are mutually influential among the Margi and Desi modes of expression within a given location time nexus. So you have geographically across space, you have temporally over the centuries or over decades, as the case may be, but you also have at a given time and place between the uh, stylized and the commonplace, the popular and the elite, the classical and the folk. This vertical integration is the most palpable in performance cultures. Epic performance practices simultaneously employ the four modes of Abhinaya, Angika, Vachika, Aharya, and Satvika for expressive communication through the limbs, through the voice, through the attire and the makeup of the artists. They assume a certain character, and through Satvika, or the natural responses of a person. And the rasika and the audience then relates, in reciprocates. He or she is also part of the performance, shaping the performance. Performance as spontaneous creation, born of artistic intuition and creativity, and its reception by the rasik is of essence. The composers, actors, and audience together recreate a narrative or its subplot. Epic performance traditions of all kinds bear the ancient in its innate flux as inherited wisdom and recreate its contemporary presences. In visual and literary cultures, the process is analogous. There is spontaneity in the making, but its creative moments can be experienced not as they happen, as in the case of performance, but they can be experienced and interpreted only after the composer artist has completed their work. These are some interpretive frames that could be extended, for there can be many more Ramayanas and there can be many more books on them. New tellings continue to be created, and the ways of perceiving are many as well. To privilege any monolithic or exclusive reading, कि यही है Ramayana, then is antithetical to its very essence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Parul Pandya Dhar. It was a fascinating 1 hour 15 minute.
I'm
Uh,
sorry I took so much
no,
time.
no, we
Okay.
enjoy each and every moment of that, and
Okay.
you actually reminded all of us A.K. Ramanujan's 300 Ramayanas, the various
Yes.
traditions, and the fact that we should never forget that there is no one version or interpretation of Ramayana as such.
Yes. Yes,
So
absolutely.
thank you. I mean, in these days when uniformity is trying to be brought about, not only in thinking but also in practices, in everything, you came here to remind us that there are multiples of traditions, multiples of interpretations, and how one reacts to them. Thank you very much. Now,
Yes.
before I give my own, reactions to that, I'm no expert of the field. In spite of that, whatever I could get from your lecture, I would be discussing that with you. But before we do that, let us have some questions. I presume that there are a number of questions which have been asked. Zainab Naqvi from Aligarh Muslim University, she asks, thanks for the intriguing presentation, Professor Dhar. A couple of years ago, Dr. Audrey Trushke found herself engrossed in a controversy for her translation of Sita's criticism of Rama in the Valmiki Ramayana as misogynist. The term used by Sita, as referred to by Professor Goldman, was Salusa. She was accused of doing a loose translation. What's your opinion on the same, and how does one address the issue of limitations of modern language and its connotations when addressing ancient texts like the Ramayana, which are also religiously sensitive? Your reaction.
Okay. Thank you, Zainab Naqvi, for bringing that issue. Actually, this is something that is between Audrey Trishe and Professor Goldman. This was a debate, and I think that Professor Goldman's decades of analysis of the text and his understanding of the terms that are used and their connotations are certainly worth a very serious consideration. I think that this is not something that I am, I can pass a judgment on. This is something that has already been conveyed very clearly in emails and in correctives that Professor Goldman released in brief, that he does not agree with Trushke's translation. So really, the best person to take this up with would be Professor Goldman, not me. But I certainly respect Professor Goldman's opinion on it. Your other thing is, how does one address the issue of limitations of modern language and its connotations when addressing ancient texts? This is something that ancient historians are constantly facing. We don't even have to come right up to the modern period for it. There are the semantics of the usage of a term is changing from one century to another, and it's a very in-depth study by scholars of language and linguists, by historians of texts, who have to understand what a particular term may be may be actually how the meaning is changing. So coming to the modern period, certainly a lot of cross-referencing, a lot of very fundamental research with in what different ways has the term been used really in the different sources, uh, in different centuries, is a question that is extremely complex. There is no one answer to it.
Absolutely, there's no one answer to it. There's another question, this time by Muhammad Aftab Alam. Muhammad Aftab Alam asks, despite the literary, cultural, historical, and spiritual values represented by epics, and more specifically Ramayanas, is it not a possibility that such epics also serve as a tool of political, geographical imagining in relation to construction of a national political community?
Okay. The last three words bring in the nation there, so that really changes the whole discussion and brings it to a very different level. But the first part of the question is about literary, cultural, historical, and spiritual values represented by epics, specifically the Ramayana. It has been used in uh, in the way different dynasties have postured themselves. You don't have we will come to the national aspect in a while, but say in the 4th 5th century inscriptions also, uh, the king is assumed to take qualities of Rama, or the enemy is given the qualities of Ravana. In the second millennium, you have Ravana's whole the Ravana appearing in a much more sympathetic light. So different over time, its the role of the epic in, to use Sheldon Pollock's term, political imagination, has been not missing at all. And there was a big there was not a, well there was a as academics all often have, a disagreement on when exactly the Ramayana really entered the political imagination, between Sheldon Pollock and Brajadulal Chattopadhyay, which is a paper worth your read, Ramayana and the Anachronism of Political Imagination, where then the idea that the cult of Rama is actually in response to the coming of the Turushkas is contradicted. And my own research on the subject has shown that much before the advent of Islam, the Ramayana has been used as a political tool. I mean, not a political tool would be a wrong word to use, but you know, as a way of imagining it enters the larger moral, cultural, and political fabric, and becomes part of it. So now, coming to it being used as a tool in the construction of a national political community, yes, indeed, and very unfortunate indeed. Because as you saw, there isn't just one Ramayana. So which one of them is being used for constructing a national political community? A misinformed one, a misinformed Ramayana.
Right. There is another question by Dr. Shivangini Tandon.
Okay.
Thank you for an absolutely brilliant lecture, as always.
Thank you,
Ramayana,
Shivangini.
Ramayana as a Mahakavya, with its assimilative power and plural renderings, has always fascinated me. I think a very significant aspect of this epic that you talk, as well as your recent book highlights, is that it is in constant transition in diverse spatial and temporal settings.
Yes.
I want you to shed some light on the Indian Sufi appreciation, especially from the 15th and 16th centuries, of versions of narratives of this Mahakavya around the ethical figure of Sri Ram of Ayodhya. Do you think this dimension has some bearing on the performative tradition as well as the religious plurality of this epic?
So the Sufi traditions I am no expert on, but I can only merely corroborate your viewpoint, Shivangini, that there is a very robust tradition of in the Sufi appreciations and versions of the narrative, and yes, it has influenced the performatives as well. The answer has to be brief because I am no expert on Sufism.
Uh, right. Uh, Raziuddin Aqil Saab.
Well, he is an expert on Sufism.
The
so
next.
so maybe the question can be directed to him. Yeah. Yeah, but
वैसे
but but let's address his question first. Yeah.
yes. Thank you for this outstanding work, Professor Dhar. Can you please share some more of your insights on the background which made it possible
Okay.
of connected history, political, commercial, and cultural context and connections which made it possible, the
Hmm.
fascinating appropriation of the rich Ramayana tradition in wonderful ways?
Yeah. So you see, what Professor Akil, thank you, Professor Akil. Um, he is my colleague, so thank you, Razi. The whole movement of the Ramayana from, into Southeast Asia uh, is part of the larger aspects of the connected histories between India and Southeast Asia. And you have many theories or that underpin that have been studied, historically explored and conceptually explored. So you have theories that privilege trade, theories that privilege religion, and theories that privilege political motivations, political, R.C. Majumdar and all spoke about colonization of Southeast Asia, those theories which have been debunked in the larger context. So along with, actually, religion and trade moved together, and the transmission of and the migration of ideas, people, objects, narratives, oral traditions happened along with motives largely related to trade and the travel of monks, the travel of Buddhist monks, the travel of Brahmins. It is a wrong notion that Brahmins did not cross the oceans. So, for example, Kaundinya is recorded not only in the Sanskritic inscriptions of Southeast Asia, but also in the Chinese annals, like Liangshu mentions Huntian. Huntian is none other than Kaundinya. So the movement of people, the movement of religious preceptors, the movement of traders and merchants, they carried elements of culture, what I would like to call, and elements of culture both in intangible and tangible ways. And this movement was neither one sided nor was it at a given point only. And therefore, the study of the Ramayana narratives across the Indian Ocean falls within the larger interactions between India and Southeast Asia. And it would be really delightful to see such a volume coming out of Eastern Indian connections, let's say with Java and Bali. You still have the Bali Yatra going. This answer can become very long, so I should stop here. But thank you for raising this very important point.
Thank you very much. There's a question by Shankar Narayan Malik. Malik Saab asks, the lecture is quite insightful, but what I observe is that the aspect of Kalinga's connection with Southeast Asia, especially Bali, Indonesia, and Cambodia, need to be studied and highlighted, as there are enough pointers to the religious and cultural elements in those countries, including Ramayana, has spread through Shalap
Shailodhava.
Shalodbhada dynasty of Kalinga and other channels. The styles of dance, sculpture, and murals seem to bear a striking resemblance to those of present day Odisha.
Sure. I presaged your question. So I just spoke about the Bali Yatra just before you. And so actually, I answered, the answer came before the question, if I may say, Professor Rezavi. I
Yeah,
mentioned that I would like a book on East India and Southeast
yes,
Asia, and there is a lot of connection. But I couldn't even, not me, but me and the 18 other very erudite scholars, uh, there is so much more that can be done between South India and Southeast Asia.
right,
So, I mean, we can have many more books, and Eastern Indian connections with Southeast Asia, particularly with Java and Bali, and the Bali Yatra, and all of that. Kalinga. Kalinga is a very important port, from where Southeast Asian connections need to be studied. There's no doubt about it. They have
right.
been studied. A lot has been done, but yes, why not on the Ramayana traditions as well?
Sure enough. I mean, let's have two more questions. One is by Lakshmi Kant Mishra. Uh, it is true that Rama legend reached out to the people across the country, but it failed to provide historical strings. Scholars have tried to delineate vernacular tradition of writing history from Mahabharata, but not from Ramayana. Can you throw some light on the concept of time and history in Ramayana?
But why would you say that it has been ignored by historians? Thank you for the question. But I don't think that it has been ignored by historians at all. And in fact, from Romila Thapar onwards, the epics have been studied by historians very seriously. Yeah, I
Yes,
don't.
I think so. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
And the last, possibly, Shankar Sharma.
Hmm.
Madam, what could be the possible reasons about not inscribed any content or context about epic in Brahmi and Kharoshti inscriptions anywhere in it? It is not evident. Although the culture was already prevailing during the time of these scripts in practice.
So the southern Brahmi is what one has been referring to. But are you talking of the earlier period, that is of the pre-Gupta Empire period?
Possibly, I mean,
Uh,
that is what
I assume that is the period that he is referring to, because the transformations of Brahmi are to be seen in early medieval South India and other places, also in Southeast Asia. So there you have the epic mentioned, and that is a southern version of Brahmi that talks about the Ramayana and Rama and Ravana. But I think the reference is to an earlier period, the pre for just for ease of talking, I say pre-Gupta period. I'm not suggesting that that is the best term to use. uh, the Dashrath Jataka is there, but not in the form of any inscribed thing. I think that Valmiki's Ramayana actually drew from a range of oral traditions, and no, we didn't have the Ramayana in prevalence as the Ramayana in the material culture, and you don't have them in the pre-Gupta period really. But you do have sculptures of the Ramayana and also inscriptions identifying the characters of the Ramayana. In fact, in the Jhajjar Museum, you will find the verses inscribed. They are Gupta period, and they are in Brahmi actually. So does that answer your question? You have actually whole lines written in Brahmi, and these terracotta pieces are in Jhajjar.
hopefully, I mean, if he may put up a subsidiary question if possible, but unfortunately, I think even if he puts it up, you would be able to answer it at some later point of time,
Yes,
because we have already
yes,
crossed 1.5 hours, and
right.
I am also interested, I mean, to make certain comments. Although I had a number of questions, very layman questions, but now as the time has crossed its limits, I would just point out that I would have wished uh, if your book would have also referred to. I mean, for example, there was a question on the influence on Sufi traditions. I mean, I would be more interested as an Indian living in this present age, full of strife and full of Jai Shri Ram slogans, to know more about what was the influence in India rather than what was happening in Indonesia or Cambodia. I mean, you did point out that there are traditions where legends were developed that when the division of Sri Lanka was made, Adam got only, if I remember correctly,
1/4.
1/4 of it, the other parts went to Ram. Uh,
Ravan.
we have traditions in India starting from Hazrat Amir Khusro, who in fact points out that India was a country where Adam had been sent. It was his land, and that is why it is so good and pak to him. I mean, I'm not going into the details of that.
So,
Uh,
so since this, I'm just interjecting for a moment, and then I will stop. Since
sure,
this
sure.
is focused on South India, I
Yeah,
was not able to bring in these aspects into it. But a
sure.
volume on North India should definitely bring that up.
Right. So, I mean, it makes me easy. I mean, number of my questions then suddenly disappear with that, of yours. Otherwise, I would have been really interested. What was the influence of the Rama traditions on the developing Islamic philosophy? We know that as late as 20th century, we have an Indian poet, an Indian till his death.
Well, I was recently reading a review of Muzaffar Alam's book in the front line. I just recently read it. And,
Right.
this whole thing of Dara Shuko's posturing,
Yeah.
of as, in the manner of Rama or Rama's
Mm.
brother, I found very interesting. So these
Exactly.
are issues that I hope that will come up in more volumes.
Hopefully.
Particularly, this one tried to focus on South India and Southeast Asia, and
Right.
some other volumes could take up more regional studies of the Ramayana. In fact, in Southeast Asia, a lot of Islamic Ramayanas are explored in this book, in the Southeast Asian context, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia. And if you will allow a quick sharing of my personal experience when I was in the area of Prambanan in Central Java doing my research work, I attended a live performance of the Ramayana. Uh, the audience, the women were all wearing scarves. They were largely a Muslim audience, and the epic was theirs, and the person playing the character of Rama and the lady playing the character of Sita were both practicing, they both practiced Islam. So this is how the tradition has developed, and very peaceful, extremely peaceful. So I think looking outwards rather than only looking at India all the time also helps us to realize, what are we fighting for? What are we fighting for?
Exactly.
So these are issues. There is so much more to it that there is no end to. I think
And
I
yeah,
just hope it provokes. If it provokes more research and more books, it's done its work.
and I really hope that a companion volume on retelling Ramayana in North India also comes out, where I
Absolutely.
mean that would be very interesting to see. I mean, there are many aspects of Ram which do trouble the present day Indian society, and possibly such a study
Of the
would be.
monolithic Ram, of the
Yes,
monolithic Ram and the angry Hanuman. We need to do away
right,
with them.
right, right,
Yeah.
right. Well, I would take this opportunity to once again thank Professor Dhar for a really very illuminating lecture. As all of you heard her speak, I mean, in detail about the book, not only about her own contributions, but the entire volume which is before us. How the entire volume is divided into three sections, dealing with visual arts, literary cultures, as well as performance cultures, with a number of contributions in each of the sections. It's a remarkable volume, and I would, in fact, request each and every one of you who can get hold of it to really read this work. I mean, there are a large number of insights which people like us would get from a well-researched work like the one which has been presented by Professor Dhar. I would end by just once again reiterating the importance of having a similar work being done on the North Indian traditions as well. You know, when I started my introductions, I pointed out that it was during the 16th century that the legend of Ram started developing at a popular level as far as North India was concerned. When we heard Professor Dhar, we realized that the tradition elsewhere in South India and Southeast Asia was quite developed and quite popular at every level till date. But as far as the northern parts of the country is concerned, it was during the 16th century with, I may be wrong, but that is my impression of whatever I have read, that it was with the writing of Manas of Valmiki, which popularized the legend, and actually the name of Lord Ram became a household name in the Indo-Gangetic basin. It was also the time when, the Ramayana as well as Mahabharata and other texts were picked out to be translated into Persian. Not only to be picked out for translation into Persian, and one would actually be very interested to know, how it was interpreted at a time when it was being translated into Persian. We know what type of people were involved in the translations. Yes, there were Brahmins who were helping out these Mughal scholars. But Badayuni, one of the primary translators, the charge was given to Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni. And he was horrified by the fact that he is being made to, translate those concepts which are actually anathema for him. So my interest or anybody's interest would be that to come to know how when it was rendered into Persian, what type of rendering went to it.
So,
Was it
Professor,
only
yeah,
right?
sorry, Professor
Right.
Rizavi, when that happens, when the Ramayanas of northern India from the 16th century onwards are taken up, I really wish that the Islamic Ramayanas of Java and Malaysia are also used in comparative frameworks, because some of them are earlier. Uh,
Actually,
so,
actually,
and it will be very nice to see what became important uh, to the translators and to the performers and to the artists, because they are there in the visual arts as well. They are there in the performing arts as well. And so also to see how the Ramayana has flourished in nations today that are dominated by an Islamic population, that demographically where Islam dominates, how the Ramayana is negotiated with.
exactly,
And
exactly,
if that is taken into account when the Mughal Ramayanas and the Sufi Ramayana traditions are studied, that would open us out of a certain tendency towards very insular histories. Because what is different also becomes very important to contextualize our own identity. How we are similar but also how we are different can tell us what we are about.
exactly.
This is my feeling about the
I mean,
about and I
right.
really hope that a book like that comes out.
And I also hope that
Mm.
just like your work, someone
Mm.
also apart from taking up the interpretative part in the translations, how it is being interpreted in a scholarly way, another attempt is made, as you did in one of your sections, how it was visualized by the artists.
Oh, that
I
is
mean,
very scholarly, Professor Rizavi. I
yeah,
tell
yeah,
you,
it is,
you
it
know,
is, it is.
I often get questions from very, very enlightened people who
Huh.
send me a sculpture or who
Hmm.
send me a painting, and then they ask me, then they say, "Sorry to bother you for a trifling matter, but could
Yeah.
you tell us what this is about?"
Hmm.
Now, actually telling what it is about requires texts and inscriptions and sources and a huge amount of visual literacy. So, I think that historians really need to engage more with the visual, not to really bring in the visual or to oblige the visual, but for actually
Exactly.
more comprehensive histories to emerge.
It's
That's my
thanks to
feeling.
scholars like A.K. Das and certain others
Yes, absolutely.
who
Brilliant scholar,
studied the
Professor A.K. Das.
illustrations of the Ramayana. The Ramayana illustrations which are there in the City Palace Museum in Jaipur, as well
Hmm.
as certain attempts have been made to study the Ramayana which is there in Free Art Gallery.
Oh, I'm
There are
an absolute fan of, I'm an admirer of Professor A.K. Das's work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
He's such
think
a guiding light.
more than dealing with these beautiful paintings from the perspective of an art historian, work is needed from a point of view, a scholar going much beyond that and trying to interpret how the reception of Lord Ram and his story was during the period when the illustrations are being made. I mean, these are the illustrations which are being made not only by the painters, but they are being commissioned by the elites of the society. Even their version is going into it. So, and that is why there is a much more need for such a volume to come out. I know that you have many more things.
I want to end with a joke. May I?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. So, this whole thing about what is the job of an art historian is a very tenuous question, really. So, the art historian is not really just supposed to interpret and tell you कि इस हाथ में ये पकड़ा है और ये style है
exactly.
or you know.
Yeah,
But the moment that the real art history, actually, I always tell my students in the department in Delhi, please don't think that you're going to be looking at pictures and enjoying them through the semester, because let me tell you that all the skills that you need to be a good historian are required here. And in addition, you need vast amounts of visual literacy. And that's what then makes an art historian. But the interesting thing is that the minute I started doing it some decades ago, I was told, but you're not just an art historian, you are a performance studies person, and you're an art historian, and then you are a cultural historian. So when I started doing the job of an art historian seriously, I was told I'm not really an art historian. So, but the art historian is supposed to be doing all this. Otherwise, it would be art interpretatory without the historical sources. That's about it. Thank you so much for this wonderful
uh,
opportunity to talk with everyone.
thanks are due to you that for a beautiful exposition. In the end, only one sentence which I would use is that you actually reminded us today what Allama Iqbal had pointed out during the early part of the 20th century, that Ram was actually Imamul Hind, and how his influences were not confined only within the confines of the subcontinent, but his story, his ideals, the cultural realm went out of the subcontinent
I think we lost Professor Rizavi due to internet connection, or is it just at my end? I'm not sure.
So I think because of the internet connection, we've lost Professor Rizavi here. But I want to thank you formally, Parul ma'am. Not only have you been my professor and you have taught me and you've made me look, at things visually or otherwise from a different perspective. I've gained so much from you, and today's talk was fantastic. It was superlative. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Shagufta. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank Professor Razavi on my behalf. I think we've lost him on live on the show, but we are through, and I enjoyed myself very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank everyone who was here listening in and also asking questions. I hope to see you Saturday at 7 next week. Bye bye.